Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour tout le monde. Bon après-midi. Je m'appelle Monica Gattinger. Je suis directrice de l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique. Les mots d'ouverture pour cet événement vont être prononcés par Madame Martine Lagacé, la vice-rectrice associée à la promotion et au développement de la recherche au sein du vice-rectorat à la recherche et l'innovation de l'Université d'Ottawa. I will just say that again for our American friends. The opening words today will be given by Martine Lagacé, Associate Vice President of Research Promotion and Development with our Vice President Research and Innovation Office. Martine, à toi la parole. Alors, bonjour à toutes et à tous, dear participants, dear colleagues. Mon nom est Martine Lagacé, comme mentionné par ma collègue, professeur Gattinger. I'm Associate Vice President, Promotion and Development of Research at the Office of Research and Innovation at the University of Ottawa. C'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je suis ici cet après-midi pour donner le coup d'envoi de cet événement commémoratif Bromley. Je tiens tout d'abord à saluer Dr. Mona Nemer, conseillère scientifique en chef du Premier ministre du Canada, du ministre de l'Innovation, des Sciences et de l'Industrie et du cabinet, et celle qui est aujourd'hui l'invitée d'honneur de la conférence Bromley 2022. Bienvenue, Dr. Nemer. Greetings to Nicolas von Hortas, the Director of the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at George Washington University, to Jeff Kinder, Senior Fellow at University of Ottawa's Institute for Science, Society and Policy, and to Professor Monica Gattinger, the Director of ISSP. Greetings to our distinguished guests and our fellow graduate students, including Ruth Cooper from George Washington University and PhD student Sarah Laframboise from University of Ottawa, who both embody the next generation of science and technology advisors. Yes, we can applaud. Donc, à toutes et à tous, grand bienvenue à l'Université d'Ottawa. Et avant toute chose, permettez-moi de rendre le traditionnel hommage que nous devons au peuple algonquin. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I must say that after so many virtual meetings, it is a pleasure to finally welcome you in person here at the University of Ottawa, right in the heart of the nation's capital for this 2022 edition of the Bromley Memorial event. And it is nonetheless good to know that some of you are still able to virtually attend this event from Washington, D.C., and from all corners of Canada and the United States. So it seems we have the best of both worlds today. Thanks to the long-lasting collaboration between both institutes and to the leadership of their current respective directors, Professor von Hortas and Professor Gattinger, this joint annual event continues to provide graduate students with a tremendous opportunity to be inspired by and to exchange ideas with senior policy advisors in science and technology from our two nations. It is a testimony to the quality of this event that it offers participants the privilege to hear firsthand experiences and insights from high-level science advisors, such as Canada's Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Mona Nemer, or as her American counterpart, Director of the U.S. National Science Foundation, Dr. Panchanathan, who was last year's keynote speaker. Named after Canadian-born David Allen Bromley, the Yale physicist who became the first science diplomacy champion in the USA, the Bromley Memorial is also a unique forum for informing the conversation on Canada-US relations in science and science policy. The University of Ottawa is among Canada's top universities in terms of research intensity, and our strategic research approach is aligned with our Transformation 2030 roadmap for the next decade, which prioritizes excellence, relevance, impact, and inclusion. We aim to be recognized for our commitment to making the greatest positive impact to society through education, interdisciplinary research, and knowledge mobilization. So building on our wealth of talent, on our strong vision for innovation, on our commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and bilingualism, and on our strategic access to decision makers, research at the University of Ottawa aims to help our nation meet domestic and global challenges of the 21st century knowledge economy by informing and shaping public and science policy. Research and teaching institutes like the ISSP that build bridges across campus between the academic, public, private, and civil society sectors and across national borders while providing rich student experiences and ensuring greater equity, diversity, and inclusion in research are instrumental in achieving these objectives and maximizing impact. Science and technology advising has shown to be a vital compass to policymakers during the troubled times we have just been through. And bringing science and technology at the policy table is most likely what you are considering achieving as potential future science advisors in your respective disciplines, with a view to improve society and political leadership. The keynote by University of Ottawa's former VP Research and the entire Bromley Memorial event will certainly be a renewed source of inspiration to all of you. Je vous quitte avec ces mots et vous souhaite une session fructueuse et très enrichissante de discussion aujourd'hui et je cède la parole à Dr. Mona Nemer.
Merci Martine pour ces beaux mots. On apprécie fortement l'appui du Bureau du vice-rectorat à la recherche et à l'innovation aux activités des instituts comme l'Institut sur la science, la société et la politique publique. Comme j'ai mentionné tantôt, my name is Monica Gattinger. I'm director of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. We are a cross-faculty research institute at the University of Ottawa, and we have a new strategic vision, which is very bold and ambitious, which is to help Canada transform decision-making for the grand challenges of our time. This is going to be done by helping to bring together and strengthen relationships amongst academia, civil society, business, and government decision makers. I'd like to welcome students here from the University of Ottawa and from George Washington University. I'd like to mention to you, anybody who is wearing a name tag like this is either part of the organizing committee for the Bromley or is a graduate student participating in the Bromley. So I'd encourage any of you here today to please take the opportunity to say hello and make yourself acquainted with our students. The Bromley Memorial Event and Lecture, affectionately known as the Bromley, is a signature annual event for the ISSP. It brings together graduate students from the University of Ottawa and from the George Washington University. We alternate back and forth between Ottawa and Washington, DC to learn about science policy and Canada-US science relations. As Martine mentioned, it is named after David Allen Bromley, one of the world's leading nuclear physicists. Born in Westmeath, Ontario in 1926, he held degrees from Queen's University and the University of Rochester. Dr. Bromley, and this is the interesting part, sat on President Reagan's White House Science Council, a Canadian, and he was the first person to hold the cabinet level rank of Assistant to the President for Science and Technology from 1989 to 1993, a position he held during the administration of George H.W. Bush. The fact that a Canadian held the post speaks to the close relationship between Canada and the United States on the bonds of friendship, trust, and collaboration that bind our two countries together. Dr. Bromley passed away in 2005. To mark his important contributions to science policy, science advice, and Canada-US science relations, Dr. John de la Moth, Canada Research Chair and Professor at the University of Ottawa, founded the annual Bromley Memorial Event and Lecture. John, as many of you know, passed away in 2007. I am sure he would be very pleased to know that the Bromley is still going strong. This year is particularly exciting. After 2 years of not being able to gather in person, we are gathering in person for the Bromley. This lecture is hybrid, but the students are with one another in person today, as well as tomorrow, to meet and to learn from various science experts and practitioners. We hope to foster bonds of friendship and collaboration among the students from both institutions. Our moderator this afternoon is Dr. Jeffrey Kinder, Senior Fellow at the ISSP and Executive Director, Science and Innovation at the Institute on Governance. Dr. Kinder has over 30 years of experience. That was 30, not 3. You might look like it's only 3, Jeff, but we all know it's 30. In government science, technology, and innovation policy in the US and Canada. His US experience includes the National Science Foundation, the National Academies, and the Naval Research Laboratory. I can't think of a more fitting person to moderate this session. After the lecture, Jeff will moderate a discussion with 2 of our participating students, fittingly, one from the United States and one from Canada. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce this year's Bromley Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Mona Nemer. Dr. Nemer is the Chief Science Advisor to Canada's Prime Minister, Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, and Cabinet. Her mandate is to provide advice on issues related to science and government policies that support it. We actually spoke about your role this afternoon, Mona, at a number of our lectures. So we're very delighted to have you here today. And I think the students are really excited for your lecture. Before becoming the Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Nemer was Professor and Vice President Research at the University of Ottawa and Director of the school's Molecular Genetics and Cardiac Regeneration Laboratory. Dr. Nemer is a leader in the area of molecular cardiology. Her work has contributed to the development of diagnostic tests for heart failure and the genetics of cardiac birth defects. She has published more than 200 highly cited scientific articles and trained over 100 students from around the world. Indeed, I think it is her dedication to students that really stands out in much of her career. Dr. Nemer is a member of the Order of Canada, a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences of the Royal Society of Canada, a Knight of the Ordre National du Québec, and a Knight of the French Republic's Ordre National du Mérite. She is also a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Nemer's talk this afternoon is entitled The Complex Role of Science Advice in Informing Policy, and I can't wait to hear it. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Nemer to the podium.
Alors, bon après-midi à tout le monde, chers collègues, chers élèves, chers amis. So, good afternoon, everyone, dear colleagues, above all, dear students. This is just so delightful to be here. It feels a little bit strange to be introduced in this room. I almost feel like, you know, I spent so much time here, but I just look and see all these faces. Some I know, some I don't know, but above all, it's just so wonderful that we're all meeting in person again. And I mean, I think words can't describe how happy I am to see that we're able to do this again. And before starting, you know, giving my presentation, Monica, let me just say how proud I am of the work that you've been doing at the ISSP. How proud I am, in fact, of the University of Ottawa and the team that followed me and is doing great work. But je me souviens encore là, assis dans mon bureau, en train d'essayer de te convaincre de prendre le poste. Alors, comme quoi, il faut jamais, don't ever give up if you want someone to do what you feel will be the best possible leader for something. I think you just like, don't take no for an answer. At any rate, it's just so great to see all the great work that you do. Je dois dire que je suis plutôt émue et vraiment très honorée de donner la conférence Bromley de cette année. et de joindre la liste des distingués conférenciers précédents, dont certains j'ai eu le plaisir moi-même d'accueillir dans cette pièce ou dans d'autres pièces de l'Université d'Ottawa, donc en ma qualité de vice-rectrice à la recherche. I'm really humbled to join the list of the distinguished previous Bromley lecturers, many of whom I had the pleasure of welcoming in this or other rooms of the campus. And I do remember, I think it was one of the first ones where we even had chocolates, dark chocolate. So that definitely stood out. Well, I'm going to start by echoing the words that you have mentioned about the longstanding relationship between George Washington University and the University of Ottawa. It's a partnership that has done so much to encourage student mobility, as well as promote multidisciplinary research, and of course, the science and science policy nexus. I am so grateful for these laudable efforts and delighted that they brought us here this afternoon. You mentioned John Motta, and I interacted with him at the beginning of my mandate before he so unexpectedly passed away. And he was so passionate about science policy and science advice. I'm sure he'd be very proud of the work that has been carried on. Donc, as the largest universities in their respective capital cities, both the University of Ottawa and George Washington universities are the flagships of the thriving academic relationship between our nation capitals. And they are, of course, situated strategically and in an enviable way to interact with policymakers and to interact with the business sector. So in many ways, they are uniquely placed to bring together these different actors that are needed to move our policies and to move our societies, starting from our capitals. Our universities represent our shared values and culture, and moreover, the long-standing extraordinary alliance and deep friendship between Americans and Canadians. Washington, D.C., where I wish I was there, notwithstanding my allergies, my spring allergies, was the first international city I traveled to after taking office almost 5 years ago. It was November, and it sure felt coming from Ottawa like you're going to the tropics. But the weather was not the high point of the trip. Importantly, I had the opportunity to meet with my American colleagues in science policy. Of course, I had many colleagues and collaborators on the science side in Washington, D.C. and the area, whether it's at NIH, Rockville, and elsewhere. But this was an opportunity really to see the seamless working relationship between key players in the science advisory system. And of course, in addition to the universities, the US national academies that bring together the best of our scholars and scientists, the well-established organizations like the AAAS, and of course, culminating with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, which advises the highest office in the nation and whose very existence is enshrined in legislation. My office over the years has built a great working relationship with the OSTP and the various OSTP directors over the years, and we're currently working with them on their scientific integrity framework. We have a lot to share and a lot to learn from each other. The OSTP has had many decades to establish itself. And in fact, the man we're remembering today, Dr. Alan Bromley, as mentioned by Monica, was himself its director from 89 to 93. A Canadian who went back and forth across the border and back and forth between academia and science advice. Certainly an inspiration for my own, anyway, career trajectory. Over the decades, the ease with which he was able to move across our border and to contribute to our societies speaks to the interconnectedness between Canadians and Americans that we have probably all lived and sometimes taken too much for granted, perhaps even over decades of international turmoil and present turmoil as well. It's nevertheless remarkable how we remained great friends and allies. I myself know this from experience, as the US was my first second home after leaving the war in Lebanon. So from doing my undergraduate in Wichita, Kansas, yes, American colleagues, Wichita, Kansas, I went on to do graduate studies at McGill in Montreal, went back to work in Bethesda in a private sector company, came back to Montreal for postdoc, returned to New York for my training, and came back to Canada for my career as a researcher, and now with the federal government as the chief science advisor. So I have experienced firsthand and benefited in many ways from the rich diversity of North American cultures. And again, that's something that we underestimate and that we take for granted. In a time when so many countries' borders are rife with conflict, our two nations are joined by the longest peaceful border to the world that the world has ever seen. And in fact, when the border was closed during the early stages of the COVID, it was so unprecedented that it made headlines for months and months on. The fact that we share so much provides us all with both freedoms and opportunities. We see this not only in the millions of our citizens who cross the border every day to work, trade, shop, and visit, or in the innovative business relationships, or in the students who study at our schools, or even in our scientific partnerships. But we also see it in our shared values, embracing diversity as a strength, making decisions based on evidence, knowing that science and innovation improve our lives. In this regard, Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden recently signed the roadmap for a renewed Canada-US partnership, almost like renewing, I guess, your vows if you're married after a while. And that's a blueprint for guiding our partnership in 6 general areas: fighting COVID, and just a reminder, it's not over yet; building back better; accelerating climate ambitions; building global alliances; and bolstering security and defense while advancing diversity and inclusion. All of these are important areas for building security and prosperity. But what strikes me most is that each of these priorities needs and benefits from effective science policy. Well, after 2 years of the COVID pandemic, we have learned a few lessons. How science was our exit strategy from the crisis. How international collaborations were key to developing and deploying solutions. How coordination was critical for cross-border policy. And importantly, how an emergency is no time to start developing trusted relations between people and their institutions or between countries. These need to already be well in place and, again, not taken for granted. So what I want to talk to you about today is why all aspects of our decision-making need to be appropriately informed by the relevant scientific evidence, why collaboration among established networks of experts is key to finding solutions to our global challenges, and why getting there requires the interest and engagement of our youth, who are our next science and science policy leaders. Alors, en acceptant le poste de conseiller scientifique en chef, je souhaitais augmenter la visibilité et la place de la science dans les prises de décision et améliorer la culture scientifique de notre société. Je ne prévoyais certes pas être plongé dans une pandémie mondiale où la science sera sollicitée au quotidien. When I assumed the role of Chief Science Advisor, I never imagined that I would be living and working through a once-in-a-century global pandemic. From a science advice perspective, words cannot describe what the past 2 years were like. I guess the only word that I could use was never a dull moment. No one would ever wish for another pandemic, but it's important to recognize that what we have been going through does have a silver lining. It has given us the opportunity to see research inform policymaking in real time. As a consequence, more and more people have become open to and aware of science. That includes not just politicians and decision makers, but business owners, community organizers, artists, educators, and of course, the general public. That's not to say that we don't have science deniers out there, and that there are many people with whom we still need to build more trust in science. But overall, the pandemic has helped to raise the profile of science. And I think it's extremely important that we build on this momentum, but that we also learn from failed events or from collateral side effects like the massive amount of disinformation that has been generated. We, of course, hear all the time about the negative things. So we tend to think that people have lost actually trust in science. That's not the case. In fact, a report done by the Wellcome Foundation found that globally, across the world, those who said they trust scientists a lot rose from 34% in 2018 to 43% by the end of 2020. That's a huge jump in 2 years. And that's, of course, before we had widespread rollout of highly effective vaccines. Bringing science directly into people's lives and demonstrating that science saves lives has had a great impact, and one that we need to remember and to point to as we continue tackling the challenges ahead that are numerous. But can you recall a time in the past when you have seen regularly and for over 2 years, so it's not a one-off, so many scientists speaking to main media outlets and actively present on social media? I sure haven't. Things like PCR, mRNA, immunity became household words. It's just like incredible. Throughout the entire pandemic, we've seen scientists step up and not only provide advice to governments, but communicate and explain science to the public on a variety of issues. That's because there was really no aspect to this health crisis that shouldn't be informed by science. And that's why from the get-go of the pandemic, I established an expert advisory panel, actually that gave rise to several other more focused panels. And inevitably, we had representation from a very wide diversity of fields. We not only had epidemiologists, virologists, and physicians, but we had mathematicians who do modeling, who were informed by what the epidemiologists were saying, and vice versa. We had the risk and behavioral scientists who weighed in on the socio-psychological dimensions of the pandemic, who warned us of what is, ahead of us, following social distancing and people staying at home. And they also informed us as the dynamic public health measures rolled out back and forth. Those panels were just one of the many invaluable networks that we established. Of course, I worked regularly with my international counterparts and with science advisors in other levels of government to share expert opinions, learn from the experiences of other jurisdictions, and to coordinate advice to our respective governments. And I will just mention that for the first year of the pandemic, we had weekly calls that were organized by the White House Office of Science and Technology at 6 in the morning, because we had to take into account Asia, we had to take into account Europe, New Zealand, Australia. They grew from initially 7, 8 of us to over, I think, 30. And they were just so useful because we were exchanging data that was not public. We were exchanging information in real time that have helped our governments make the right decisions and not repeat the same mistakes. So this was vitally important, notably because the increased also demand for rapid science advice across many disciplines, and in the midst of this unprecedented global crisis, put just so much pressure on a limited number of scientists in each one of our countries. Other challenges for scientists and science advisors included coping with the abundance of misinformation and disinformation. That was certainly unexpected at the beginning. Effectively communicating uncertainties. I can tell you, you can read as much as you want about this, but having to do it just takes on another meaning. Explaining the scientific process as knowledge of the virus and public policy evolved. Hey, you just told me this last month. Well, yeah, but now we know more. So actually, it was quite interesting because we needed to explain the scientific method. So having established the networks helped us immensely and will continue to ensure better emergency preparedness and better communication of advice. And I say this because it's something that you all want to think about. Our next crisis, whether they are climate generated, man-made, whether they are floods or forest fires, you name it, you are going to need these networks. So it's a good idea to start getting involved in some of them. And for those who wants to provide science advice, to start thinking about setting them up. Coordinated science advice is vital to good decision-making, but it's also important to recognize that government decisions invariably take into consideration additional inputs, ranging from economics to legal or diplomatic implications to societal values and public opinion. Which is why you have also, as a science advisor, to remain humble, to provide your advice, and remember that it's not the most important thing, but you just hope that at least some of it will make it through. I'm going to give you the example of the mask mandates throughout the pandemic. And I'm sorry to say that we're talking again about masks, because when I prepared this before the decision of the federal court in the US to overturn the mask mandate in airplanes, but I think it illustrates, something that seems so benign, the dimensions that it has taken on. So scientific evidence supports the decisions to wear masks to reduce the spread of COVID-19. It's simple. That's the science. But while the science is clear, additional inputs has factored into the public health guidelines and the mandates, which of course created a lot of sort of inconsistencies across jurisdictions within the same country or across countries. Well, some of the questions that people asked were, what about individual freedoms and personal choices? What about risks to communities? What about risks to vulnerable individuals? What about availability and access to masks? What about prioritization of who should have a mask? We can go on and on. The point is, science cannot tell us directly what we should or shouldn't do. It can only tell us what is likely to happen if we do or don't do something. And as long as governments and society know this and are prepared for the consequences, the science advisors would have, I think, done their jobs. Understanding the appropriate role of science is important to allow policymakers to ask the right questions and to help scientists provide useful answers. So that's something that we actually had to do at the beginning of the pandemic. Know the questions that need to be asked and understand the relevant answers that must be given. So it's also essential for the public to appreciate the basis for public policy, which will enhance trust and, of course, the likelihood of adoption of these of the policy and the guidelines. Part of this involves effectively communicating scientific uncertainties, but also being transparent about what weighed in the decision. And I think if we do this effectively, if the public hates a policy, they're not going to hate science. And that's super important. Of course, as new evidence emerges, our knowledge and understanding of a given situation also changes. And it may be easier to explain to people at the get-go, wear a mask, do this, don't do this. In the long run, it would be much easier if from the beginning, we actually brought people along with us, explaining the basis of the decision, the basis for potential changes, and not seeing the world in white and black, even if it's much easier to do so. So I think that's something also that we need to be communicating effectively and transparently, the process itself. In reaching out to our audiences, whether they be policymakers or the public, and understanding where they're coming from, we help to build the trust that's essential for creating a scientifically informed society. And I dare say a scientific informed society is essential for democracy. So when you're considering how science and policy work together, please keep in mind all of the ways in which your knowledge and expertise can play a role. Science-trained professionals create a kind of connective tissue that's important in government and other decision-making spaces, as well as in public communication. We can see this in a couple of ways. First, the impacts of science are not limited to our labs, to our field work, or to our academic scholarship. What scientists do affects society, and there is a certain level of responsibility for us to inform, to build trust, and to help ensure that research and technologies are used well. And this can't be an afterthought. It has to be something that we build in our research from the get-go. Second, we need science-trained professionals in all sectors. There's just like no room and really no benefit in having people siloed. Thinking about policymakers as people who come from policy background and as scientists being in labs, that's totally counterproductive. Having scientists as well as policy experts at all levels of government decision making creates a common language and a mutual understanding, which will serve the government and the country very well. It's crucial in today's world where sectoral collaboration has never been more important to deal with our biggest challenges. And we know that a diversity of perspectives, expertise, lived experiences result in better and more creative problem-solving groups. I want to specifically speak to tomorrow's leaders. In many ways, your generation is much more reflective of the rich diversity of our society. And so we need your voices at the table even more. When I took on the role of the CSA, I knew that I wanted to incorporate youth perspectives in the advice I provide. And in many ways, I was missing the university and my lab and wanted to have young people around me because their perspectives are so important and you learn so much from them. So 2 years ago, we recruited 20 very bright young scientists from across the country to be my first youth council. And even though the pandemic has thrown challenges in their way and gotten in the way of us ever meeting in person, they have continuously impressed me as we went through the pandemic together. Ce groupe de jeunes scientifiques a apporté sa contribution sur des questions telles que la réponse à la COVID-19, la science ouverte et la prochaine frontière scientifique. J'ai toujours été impressionnée par leur perspicacité, la diversité de leurs perspectives qui sont nourries par leurs expériences de vie et les communautés et disciplines qu'ils représentent. We're living through unprecedented times. Society is becoming ever more digital. Technologies are advancing at breakneck speed, and climate change is no longer a matter of the future, but a reality of the present. Some have called this time the cusp of a fourth industrial revolution. It's a time of automation, data exchange in manufacturing technologies, the Internet of Things, cloud computing, cognitive and quantum computing, artificial intelligence, robotic, you name it. Your generation will lead the charge into this exciting new imagined world. And you're going to need to understand the science, to understand the societal implications of technology, not once they're deployed, but before they are deployed. And you're going to need to engage continuously with the public, a dialogue, not talk to them, but talk with the public so that we're prepared when we absolutely need their trust in a moment time. You don't have to aim right away for the highest level of influence. You can start local at your institution, in your community, in your city. There are just so many places where you can actually learn and where you can participate and share your knowledge. My office, for example, through a partnership with the Canadian Science Policy Center, has established the Science Meets Parliament program, which connects scientists and parliamentarians in an effort to build dialogue and ongoing relationship for evidence-informed policy. And it's not just established scientists that we need to get involved. In fact, the younger the interlocutor, the more attentive and impressed politicians are. Trust me. We've seen that there is a growing network in Canada of students who are interested in science policy. I applaud this. This very university has its own student group, the Ottawa Science Policy Network. At McGill, the University of Toronto, and many other institutions, students are organizing and getting involved. This engagement, your engagement, is vital. Pandemics are not the only challenges our societies face, although we may well face them again. I hope not, but never know. But we have to deal with climate change mitigation, adaptation. We do have to deal with food security, migration, social justice, natural resource exploitation. Of course, disinformation is going to be everywhere in these. Societal polarization. Scientists and policymakers will have to work together and strive to build public trust rather than throw the blame at each other's. Whether taking on global challenges, providing evidence for good decision-making, building critical thinking skills, or helping to inspire wonder and discovery, science is vital to our lives, to our societies, and to democracy. It's our greatest tool for building peace and understanding among humanity. Qu'il s'agisse de relever des défis planétaires, de fournir des preuves pour une bonne prise de décision, de développer l'esprit critique ou de contribuer à susciter l'émerveillement et la découverte, la science est essentielle à nos vies, à nos sociétés et à la démocratie. Elle est notre meilleur outil pour soutenir la paix et contribuer à une meilleure compréhension entre les humains. Looking at the US and Canada's shared air, environment, supply chains, and societal values, I see immense opportunities for working together. I also see immense benefits for the world from our bilateral and multilateral collaborations. So I encourage you to use your knowledge and expertise to serve at home, across our border, and throughout the world in your own capacity. Share your science, your discoveries, and your knowledge for the public good. After all, to quote Louis Pasteur, science knows no country because knowledge belongs to humanity and is the torch which illuminates the world. We have lived these profound words over the past 2 years like never before, and you will no doubt appreciate them in many and many years to come. Thank you for listening to me. Merci, et j'ai le plaisir de participer à la discussion.
Let me extend my welcome as well to all of you. It is, as everyone has been saying, so nice to be back in person, this first event. Let me also thank Mona for your remarks and insights, and it's generated lots of questions, so we'll have a bit of a chance for that conversation. But before we do that, I would like to introduce our 2 student respondents and allow them a few minutes each to give their responses. First up, we have Ruth Cooper. Ruth is a student at George Washington University, affiliated with the the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy. Ruth, over to you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we've had some amazing discussions today, and I'm really excited to be here. So my name is Ruth Cooper. I'm a master's student at GW studying international science and technology policy. I also work at the U.S. National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine in the Health and Medicine Division. So I'd like to thank both GW and the National Academies for supporting me to join this conference. I'm especially excited to be here in Canada because Canada holds a special place in my heart. I have family in Montreal that I'm going to see for the first time since the pandemic started after this conference. Additionally, a few years ago, I was lucky enough to be able to help with oceanographic fieldwork in the Arctic on the Canadian icebreaker, the Sir Wilfrid Laurier, with a team of US and Canadian scientists. This research cruise was part of the Distributed Biological Observatory, which is an example of successful international science collaboration. For the past 10 years, an international team of scientists from the US, Canada, China, Japan, Korea, and Russia have been collecting samples at the same locations in the Arctic at different times of the year so that there's a coordinated, consistent time series of data. As Dr. Namar mentioned, the world benefits greatly from bilateral and multilateral collaborations, especially in the Arctic, which is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is another example of a global challenge where international science cooperation is critical. The entire world has grappled with the pandemic for the past 2 years, and scientists are continuing to collaborate with their international colleagues at unprecedented levels, working to better understand the virus and its variants, and to develop effective treatments and vaccines. The pandemic has also shown how science can inform policy. Scientific advice has taken center stage, perhaps in the most public way since the beginning of the nuclear age. While it's been wonderful to see the pivotal role scientists have played in responding to the pandemic, there are inherent conflicts between scientists and policymakers that in practice often complicate the implementation of scientific advice into effective policy. One reason is value systems. Historically, scientists want to understand something for the sake of understanding something, but the policymaker has a more utilitarian approach. They need to create policies that produce the best outcomes for the most people. Timescales can also be an issue with scientific advice. Science generally takes a long time, while policy decisions, particularly in crises like the pandemic, must be made in as little as a few days. A final conflict that was very apparent throughout the pandemic response is that scientists and policymakers, as well as the general public, deal with uncertainty in very different ways. Scientists are comfortable with it, as measuring uncertainty is part of the scientific process, while policymakers would prefer concrete, correct answers as soon as possible. Ideally, scientific advice should be based on best available evidence, though in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, much of that evidence has been uncertain, rapidly evolving, and involved considerable unknowns. The urgent and short timeframes that the COVID-19 decision, the urgent and short timeframes needed for COVID-19 decisions have conflicted with the much longer timeframes for fully developed and robust scientific findings. The science was incomplete and conditional at the beginning of the pandemic, and as more data was collected, the science can change, and policies need to be flexible so that they can change as well. In such a dynamic situation, when policymakers and the public want assurance and certainty, this can become a real challenge for the scientific community. When providing scientific advice for policy, transparency, openness, and strong communication strategies are critical for the public to maintain trust in both science and policy. Scientists and policymakers need to be able to justify their advice and decisions in understandable language to have the most impact. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic showed that countries often initially respond to global challenges by first focusing on their own countries, as opposed to engaging in multilateral efforts. For example, the United States' initial reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic included withdrawing from the World Health Organization. But international engagement is critical, and I'm happy to see US policies that emphasize international cooperation in science diplomacy. I'll end with a plug for the importance of including diverse voices in science policy. And this means creating opportunities for people of all backgrounds to join the conversation and be comfortable doing so. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth. And next we'll hear from Sarah Laframboise, who is a student here at U of O and the founder of the Ottawa Science Policy Network.
Thank you. Wow, it's loud. Thank you, Jeff, and to Monica as well for inviting me to speak today. I'm so honored to be here today speaking in response to one of my personal idols in science as well. When I first started my master's at the University of Ottawa in the Faculty of Medicine, I remember walking into our lab's hallway and seeing Dr. Niemer's name on the wall and just thinking how exciting it was to be in a place where women in science could go on to become the Chief Science Advisor to Canada. I wanted to also take a moment today to comment on how lucky we are in Canada to have such inspiring advocates like Dr. Niemer for the next generation of scientists. When I first started the Ottawa Science Policy Network, we were trying to figure out exactly what we could contribute to the space of science policy in Canada. And we looked to our other student science policy groups for support. There seemed to be one present theme across all of the other groups, and that was really graduate student funding. In 2018, the Fundamental Science Review promised increased investments into graduate students. But 4 years later, this funding has yet to be seen. This is despite graduate students being major contributors to the research and innovation ecosystem in Canada. In the last 18 years, graduate student stipends have not changed. For context, graduate student stipends haven't increased since the birth of Facebook and the finale of Friends. This has created significant barriers for minorities, low-income, and marginalized communities to pursue graduate education. To investigate this, we launched our National Graduate Student Finance Survey in December of last year. Over the last 4 months, we have met with graduate student associations across Canada. We've listened to countless stories of struggles, of inequalities, and of crippling debt. Simply put, graduate students need more support. With inflation at a 30-year high, it takes only one trip to the grocery store to see that the cost of living has skyrocketed. Now, 33% of graduate students are supported by Tri-Council Awards from one of our 3 federal granting agencies. The rest are supported indirectly through their supervisors or departments, leaving students vulnerable to the financial instability within their own labs. Here at U-Ottawa in the Faculty of Medicine, a master's student makes a minimum of $19,000 per year, while a PhD student makes a minimum of $21,000 per year, with variations between faculties and departments and universities. Unless you have an excellent scholarship to cover your tuition, which the university has made detrimental cuts to this year, you're paying about $9,000 on top of this for tuition every year. This leaves a master's student with $10,000 and a PhD student with $12,000 to live off of for the rest of the year. This isn't even enough to pay for a 1-bedroom apartment in Ottawa, where on average, this is about $1,500 per month. This leaves no room for the bare necessities like food or transportation or hydro. And how about students with children or dependents? How are they supposed to pay for things like childcare or medical expenses? These were all questions that we had in our survey. Now, in general, we have found that almost 45% of survey respondents do not have enough to get by and struggle financially every single month. On top of this, 87% reported stress and anxiety about their personal finances. This is not the way to build a successful foundation of research infrastructure in Canada. Research exists off the back of graduate students. They're the ones getting their hands dirty while balancing training, taking classes, TA-ships, and academic responsibilities. More than half of our survey respondents are living with no savings at all. While their peers are starting careers and building wealth, grad students are just struggling to get by. Additionally, a study from Stats Canada in 2015 showed that nearly 65% of master's and PhD students were graduating with student debt, averaging at just under $18,000. And this is consistent with preliminary results from our survey as well. If we want students to graduate and stay in our academic infrastructure, then we need to provide a livable wage. Currently, after 10+ years of post-secondary education, we are asking these in-debt students to then continue on to a postdoc where they make less than $45,000 per year, and now this income is taxed. We wonder why only 15% of students stay within the academic ecosystem. Now, lots of people love science, but the system of science doesn't always love and support them back. We've created a system that excludes women, BIPOC, LGBTQ2+, and those with disabilities. Graduates can't afford to wait for the promised stability of an academic career. Now, I'm saying this today to spark an important conversation. Open communication and discussion on these issues will only unveil these inequalities and help empower policymakers to implement effective change. With all of the great minds in this room, we can create a system that better supports our research infrastructure, and I truly believe that we can cement Canada as a world leader in science, technology, and innovation. Now, I look forward to providing a complete report on our survey this summer, so be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at the Ottawa SciPolNet if you don't do so already, to stay up to date with some of our findings. Thank you.
So just to give you a heads up, we are going to be taking questions from the audience and from people online. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the microphone so that those who are online will be able to follow the question. And just as you're sort of thinking about what questions you may want to ask, perhaps I could just throw out an initial question to Mona regarding the whole area of science diplomacy. And I'm thinking particularly, with the war in Ukraine, what that has implications for in terms of research collaborations, either with Ukrainians or Russians. And then just more generally, the whole area of science diplomacy, it's become a very sort of hot topic. We have pandemics, climate change, there's so many global issues where we think science can play a role. I'm just wondering if you can maybe comment a little bit more in terms of, what the status is for science diplomacy in your view.
Well, I mean, science diplomacy is super important. It is something that is very close to my heart. Um, of course, the world has been busy with the pandemic and now very unfortunately with the war. But I think that the COVID pandemic actually showed us how important science diplomacy is. Because you can't be safe in your country when the rest of the world is not safe. So I think this is you know, something that's very important. And I want to salute the scientists in South Africa who actually discovered the Omicron variant. It had like such terrible consequences on the country. So when we talk about science diplomacy, I think we have to sort of broaden the definition of what it involves. It's just like if you want to work together, then it's both ways, and it means that, you know, I give you the data, I don't keep it for myself, you know, but you don't punish me for it. So I think there are a lot of lessons learned for science diplomacy from the COVID. The war is another area that is, of course, very challenging. It's and I must say that it's a very difficult topic for me as someone who has actually left her country because of the war. You know, wars are never good. There are no winners. There are only losers in wars, and usually the population, human beings in those countries are the losers. The idea of building bridges through science diplomacy is precisely to avoid wars. And then should wars, you know, in spite of our best efforts happen, at least to keep, you know, communication channels open for the after the war, because fortunately, you know, wars finish, but then the damage that they cause, you know, lingers on. And it's like you have to have these trusted relationships, you know, available and present before there is an acute crisis. When there's a crisis, it's not the time to start thinking, oh, you know, should I still allow the scientists and the artists from Russia to communicate with the scientists in the rest of the world? Should I help only the Ukrainian scientists? I mean, in general, the scientists, the artists, the scholars are not usually on the right side of governments that are not democratic. So they get just like punished twice and three times. But if there are relationships ahead of time, then people understand, there's better human understanding, there is a better collaboration that can continue. And we've seen all the good that this can do in the Middle East. You know, we've seen it in the International Space Station and so on. So I just wish that, you know, we can learn from the past, from the mistakes of the past and the present, and that we realize that international collaborations is not only through sort of your regular diplomacy, that science as a tool for diplomacy is extremely powerful and is an extremely powerful tool for democratic change and for democratic societies.
National Academies, we just had a workshop on companion animals, so pets as sentinels for environmental exposures. And there was research going on at Chernobyl, longitudinal data on stray dogs that have been exposed to heavy metals and radiation. And it's a small example, but all that research has stopped. So it's very important science diplomacy.
Fantastic.
So I also wanted to explore a little bit the machinery, and those of us in Ottawa who focus on science policy, we're often accused of over-focusing on the machinery of government. But I'm wondering, because you mentioned how, you know, in the US, there's the Office of Science and Technology Policy, there's a lot of structure there that seems to be lacking in our system. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about you know, the move towards making our ecosystem a bit more permanent, a bit more long lasting, hopefully.
what do you want me to say? Other than please help, make sure that Canada has a stable science advice system that doesn't change with its governments. The US has the Office of Science and Technology Policy doesn't change with different regimes. And they may decide to delay the appointment of the director or not, but they have to end up appointing the director. And there are expectations from the various parties about the work to be done. So I think this is very important. And it's also very important to make sure that there is a proper ecosystem, because again, I give you the example of the US, when for a while there wasn't a director of the Office of OSTP, there was still representation of the US in international forum, because it was the director of the National Academy of Sciences or the president of AAAS who knew exactly what's happening in the science ecosystem, science advice ecosystem, because they're so well linked with OSTP and with institutions and so on. So I would say that we've struggled a little bit in this country in terms of the structure of the science advice, what we call it, and so on. And I think it's time that we grow up and just have something that will, that the country will recognize and that the world will recognize. Because just imagine if we had COVID and the Office of the Chief Science Advisor, hadn't been around for 2 years. It's just like it would have been a total cacophony, of advice. Because what I say is, it's not that the government lacks science advice. There's just like such a thing as too much of it that's coming in all directions. And then in a situation where you have so much uncertainties, when the stakes are so high and so on, just imagine having to procure, vaccines before they've gone to, human trials, examining just the sort of biological evidence and so on. And just one small example. So this is not going to be the last crisis that we have. The government has established a minister of emergency preparedness. And I was pleased to see that at least science advice made it to, the mandate letter of, this new minister. But I think we need to have a stable structure for that. So
I'd love to ask, in terms of the future for science advice, what do you hope to see in Canada? Do you hope that it becomes a bit more diverse voices or departmental science advisors or things like this?
Yeah, I mean, I hope to see a well-established ecosystem, right? Because just like having the science advisor sort of a lonely voice is very actually quite taxing.
Yeah.
You have to have these connectivities to other institutions, to the Royal Society, to the national academies. The science advisors in the various departments is something that's very important, that we're working hard on, because these are the people that you can pull very quickly during emergencies. But it's also because so much happens at the level of the individual departments in terms, of course, of normal business that requires science understanding. So it's yeah, that's what we need to work on. And beyond perhaps Ottawa, I have to say that I'd like to see also science advisors in the provincial and territorial legislatures. Actually, the territories have science advisors, believe it or not, but not the provinces. And it would have been so beneficial for the country if there was such a network during the pandemic.
Okay, we've got our first question from the online audience, so let me read that. Mona, as you know, Ottawa was occupied for several weeks by truckers and their supporters whose basic premise for being there was a rejection of the advice of science, vaccination, and wearing of masks. How should scientists and science respond to this rejection of science? Is this divergence of science and public opinion something that scientists can change?
Well, yeah, I think this was quite a wake-up call, I think, for many of us, scientists and non-scientists alike, in Ottawa and across the country. I think it was a reminder that you know, we need to be speaking with the public cannot be an afterthought. Whether it's an emergency, whether you have time or you don't have time, I think it's super important to be attentive to people's, you know, understanding realities, emotions, so that, you know, things don't just like all boil over. So I think what is very important to understand, for example, why some people rejected vaccines, because it wasn't just for one reason. There were many reasons. In many cases, people's livelihood were affected, and you know, you need to understand this and address it. So it's you know, it's something that's very important. It is something that we need to reflect on and do better, you know, in the present and the future. I don't think that people, I mean, I like to believe that people don't wake up in the morning and say, I hate science. Because, you know, the same people that did not want vaccines, they all had cell phones, right? And then even the people who did not get vaccinated and unfortunately got infected and ended up in the hospital actually accepted the fruit of science, which were, you know, the treatments. So I think that, yeah, we just can't assume that everybody thinks, you know, the same way and understand how people's realities actually shape their perceptions and their views of science.
Okay, are there any questions from the audience? Let's step up to the microphone. Yeah, please. Thanks, Mona.
I'm hoping this will like open the floodgates of the questions. So I have a question for you, Mona. So interested to hear about the Youth Council. I knew obviously about its existence, but I'd love to hear like what have you been hearing from that council that has either changed your perspectives or changed the way that your office is operating, whether it's in terms of process or in terms of some of the substance of the advice that you're providing? Would love to hear about, you know, what are you hearing from young people that has surprised you, that has really informed how you're playing your role? And then the second question would be, we have a lot of young people with us here today, all of whom are interested in science and science policy. What would be the advice that you would give them based upon the trajectory of your career to date? Because as you've heard, I think you're a bit of a rock star for many people in the room here today. Thank you.
Wow, the two great questions that the answers are actually quite complex. The Youth Council, it was, you know, from the beginning of the pandemic. I'll give you some examples of, like, I didn't hear from them things that surprised me. I heard from them things that, you know, very much informed advice that we provided to government and sometimes to other organizations as well. When I was, for example, invited to provide some perspectives to CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, about like the next topics and the next problems to be addressed. I reached out to the Youth Council, and they provided, you know, such impeccable actually piece of advice that I handed it as is to the CIFAR organizers. But I give you examples. Very early in the pandemic, when we had lockdowns, when the university shut down, when labs shut down, well, they alerted us to the realities of graduate students, of research assistants, about not being paid, about the fact that they're delayed in their education and so on. And as a result, the government actually provided specific support to students, to research assistants, and also extended the granting councils, subsequently extended things. So I'm not trying to advertise, for government's action here, but honestly, I think that I'm not sure that I would have thought about it. But it came from the Youth Council. Right now, they're finishing actually their vision of a roadmap for science and technology for the country. So I'm very eager to see this. They're very, because they are very diverse. Every time we speak, you're sensitized to different realities of the people who are, for example, up north, of people, of young people who have kids. Like, not everyone is super enjoying necessarily working from home if your home is not, a big house with a backyard and stuff like this. So there is a lot of these, perspectives that have weighed in. When we talk about open science, they've participated in many of our consultations. They've participated in many of other organizations' consultations, like Granting Council and others. Participated in some more thematic advice that we gave over the pandemic. So I think it was, they learned what it's like to be providing advice, and we learned a lot from them. To the young people, I just say, don't overplan your life. I say this to everyone. They think I'm old-fashioned, but I never sort of, imagined or dreamt that I will have the position I have now. I love the position I had as VP Research. I never dreamt I would have this position. I didn't know what it was about when I started it. So I just say, just keep your mind open, embrace opportunities, and just don't have too much anxiety.
Okay, great. Monica, so there, I'm starting the gates. Lovely to meet you. My name is Alexandra Mallet. I'm an associate professor at the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. I work a lot on sustainable energy, but I also teach science, tech, innovation policy. I want to also give a shout out to my sister, Barb. She will be very jealous to know that I'm meeting you, because she is a nurse practitioner and her specialty is congenital heart disease at Toronto General Hospital. So yes, but I want to ask you about something that you said at the start, and you said, look, we have a great opportunity here in terms of science being discussed at kitchen tables, amongst our young people and our families, et cetera. And yet on the other hand, we also see this distrust in science, right? As we were talking about the Freedom Convoy, et cetera. And so my question becomes, how can we capitalize on this moment? How can we engage the public in terms of like the science advice, or are you doing a proactive outreach campaign? That's my question. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And please tell your sister that I'm sure she saves lives every day. For those who don't know, congenital heart disease is the #1 reason for death in young toddlers under 1 year old. So it's actually quite prevalent. Like there isn't a single I think way that that recipe. First of all, there are no recipes. Okay, let's put it this way. And there are just like so many people, both in the US, in Canada, and across the world, who have, been thinking about better engagement with the public. And we can give examples of productive and examples of poor engagements, what they result in. Poor engagement in the past has resulted in places in Europe and New Zealand that, where you can't do anything that has biotechnology in it for food, right? And it's a huge problem in many ways. Poor engagement resulted in us not being effectively able to roll out, for example, apps, contact apps at the beginning of the pandemic that were, in the end of the day, when you think about it, much less intrusive than the sort of manual human-based system that we had. But because we failed to explain and engage with the public about, what technology will do or will not do. And we can give many examples of these. So I think we have to learn from all this. But one thing that will not work is having conferences on university campuses and expect the public to come and to listen to us. That is just like not going to work. We have to meet the public where they are and the activities that interest them, whether it's your condo general assembly, whether it's in places like hospital waiting rooms and airports, etc. And then technology can help us. There is a scientist, Tara Moriarty, in Toronto. She has this online sort of forum open to the citizen, and they can ask questions and so on. So I think there's a variety of approaches. Like I said, we need to empower the public to be able to ask questions and not feel how would I say, diminished if they ask a question. There are no stupid questions, and people need to understand. And we also have to watch our language. Words matter. Words matter a lot. We said, I just give you the example that I actually hate the most. We said when the Omicron variant hit us that it's a mild variant. Well, it's a mild variant if you're vaccinated. It's not mild when you're not vaccinated. Just, check who's at the emergency rooms and check what just like even happened recently in Hong Kong in a population that was not well vaccinated. But by saying this and then maintaining, pressure for vaccination, we just like lost people, or some people at least, because people say, wait a minute, like, why are you still forcing me to do something that I don't need to do because, this is now mild. So I think it's all of these things. And because it has to be an ongoing dialogue, we need to, all of us, engage in it and engage in it in peace times on things that matter to people. So if it's the heat wave, if it's the floods, we just use these opportunities, to engage with them and answer their questions on science.
Yes, good afternoon. Mark Fortin from NSERC. We've just seen Budget 2022 with very, very significant investments, I would say, in innovation versus science or fundamental science. And yet we are just emerging from a pandemic where there was a really good case to be made for investing in research because it is the mRNA work that was done in the 70s, it is the antibody work, the immunology work that was done in the 60s and 70s that finally paid off and allowed us to weather the pandemic or to be better equipped to deal with the pandemic. So how do we collectively make a case for investment in fundamental research, which is the future, investing in people, students, the future innovators and inventors? How do we collectively make a better case for investment in that fundamental science, while governments typically will have an appetite for investing more on the innovation side because it's shorter term economic benefits versus the longer term sort of knowledge benefit of fundamental science? Collectively, how do we do a better job at this?
The difficult question, right? That again, there are no quick fixes. There are no quick fixes. I'm sure you still encounter within government, both on the political side and on the civil service side, so much misunderstanding of research, misunderstanding of how it's conducted, what it does, and what the dollars that the government invests actually anyway buy you. So I think that we need to do a better job, just continuously, not give up, explaining science and explaining research, but also explaining innovation. Because I'm sure you will agree with me, Mark, that the government has a different interpretation of the mRNA vaccines than you and I and some folks in this room would have. What they see is, well, we have great science, but we're unable to make a product. So we have to appreciate this. And they think, and how often do they say, we have a problem with science. We have excellent science. We have a problem with commercializing the science, with the innovation of the science. And then they keep investing in the innovation side, and they keep worsening the disconnect in the pipeline between the science and the innovation. And like every single government, right, that we've had in the past 20 years has tried to tackle the innovation. And I'm sorry to say that they've gotten it not exactly right. So I think that there needs to be understanding and coherence in what we collectively explain to them, that we had the fundamental science review 4 years, but research is not a one-off, and at any rate you need to keep up. Look what happens is in other countries, what happens in the US, in the UK, in Germany, everywhere. The solutions to the climate crisis, half of them and more, we don't have. I mean, the estimate is that there's 1/3 that we don't have the solutions, 1/3 that we need to scale up. Scaling up is not just the D in the R&D, it's a lot. And 1/3 we need to sort of deploy, we need policy. But that sort of leaves us with, a lot more of imaginative, work and discovery to be done. But it has to be, prendre notre bâton de pèlerinage and just, continue explaining what research is about. They've done it really well in the US, I have to say. When you reach the stage when the Congress and the Senate overbid the president or eliminate his recommended budget cuts, and it's a bipartisan effort, you know that you've succeeded.
Move to wrap up. Oh, sorry, 3 more questions, and then we'll move to wrap up. Vanessa.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Song. I work for Mona. Hi, Mona.
I hope you have questions for someone else.
Yes, in fact, my questions are for our 2 graduate students on the stage. You 2 are both obviously leaders in as students who engage in science policy, and I'm wondering, from my experience as a recovering graduate student myself, oftentimes scientists, graduate students with science backgrounds tend to have to create opportunities for themselves to participate in science policy or to learn what science policy even is. How do you think that institutions can better support their science-based graduate students in terms of exposure and training in policy-related fields?
Is it off? Oh, there we go. Yeah, very loaded question, so thank you. I mean, it's hard, right? Because I think a lot of the burden of these types of things falls on to grad students, whether it be creating the Ottawa Science Policy Network and us going out there and creating our own resources for ourselves. I think it's also about creating these spaces where we can have training, but also where we can advocate for future generations to have this training automatically. I know within our own department in the Faculty of Medicine, this is something that would seem so far removed from a policy learning experience. Implementing that type of training, science communications, particularly science policy training within these sort of professionalism programs that are already implemented within a lot of grad studies programs. So at least for us at the Ottawa Science Policy Network, I think that's a big thing that we're trying to push for is opening up these types of connections, even with ISSP, potentially creating more opportunities for students to have that minor in science policy. I know within the Faculty of Science, you're allowed to do a minor in science policy. So again, it's just promoting more like interdisciplinary experiences there, where again, yeah, the burden doesn't really fall on the student to go out there and find these opportunities, because it becomes a lot, and I'm sure you know as well, it becomes a lot on students to find all these opportunities. You end up juggling how many different volunteer experiences and training here and there and going to this conference that doesn't involve your own graduate studies. So yeah, definitely can become a lot.
That's a great answer that I can follow up a little on. So I think a big thing which we've talked about is funding. So I have friends that are PhD students, and some of them, their PIs will get funding for them to go to these type of conferences, whereas others will have to stay in hotel rooms of those people because they don't have that kind of funding. So I think just grants from NSF and that kind of thing, putting policy in those grants would be helpful. Clubs like yours are great for that. Luckily with our institution, it is a science policy focus. So there's a lot of opportunities in DC, but I think we could do a lot more too.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Klaus Schindel, German Embassy. I'm happy to be the science counselor there. And I'm really glad about your contributions today, and like the most the ones dealing with science diplomacy, because this is also the field I'm in. And I was wondering, you covered many actual and very severe crises, like climate crises, COVID crises, but you also tackled preparedness. And what will be the next one we have to look at? And I could imagine that'll be the way how we perform research and research cooperation with China. This is all right now, but it could develop. We have seen signs of it. And I know this is not a question that can be answered in 5 minutes or in an afternoon or in an academic experiment, but to put it practical, or love, do you have an advice to a university like the University of Ottawa, how they could be prepared, how they should develop? If it comes to future cooperation, will it be more a level one-to-one cooperation that we need more agreements? Because if it's like-minded, we agree upon a document, this gives us a guarantee how to work, or is it more among governments? Do we need a global consensus? Can this be achieved by the academies, by the unions of universities? What would be necessary to move this awareness to a level of action where you come to a future agreement?
Well, this is a fascinating actually question, because you've given the example of China, and anyway, I think that your question perfectly illustrates the importance of science diplomacy, because you can go on and off. Okay, that's one thing. Not so long ago, in this country, universities and researchers were greatly encouraged to work with China. In fact, just to be clear, there is no ban on research collaborations with China. I guess that there are, like cautious approaches, but I guess the sort of more difficult countries are going to keep changing over the years. So I would say that we need to have a principled approach, and an approach that upholds sort of science integrity in the sense of the openness, but sort of secure handling of research and the responsible conduct of research, both by researchers, but also by their institutions and their countries. I think that's something that's, very important. And if we have this principled approach, then I think we're going to manage to navigate sort of more challenging times, because of course there are like economic questions, there are political alliances that change and so on. And ideally, you want science collaborations to sort of be immune to this. Not naive, but, based on principled approaches.
No pressure. Hi, my name is Sarah Sawatsky. I am a current graduate student at George Washington University. So thank you so much for hosting us here and for your time. Your keynote speech today was very informational and inspirational. I was wondering if you could speak to skills required and perhaps lessons learned from your own experience for science policy advisors or those coming from a science and engineering background to influence change when, as you stated, the science advisory piece is only one aspect of a decision.
It's really very important. I think that the human aspect and the science advice has to be realized and is front and center. If the person you're giving advice to does not trust you or does not understand you because you're just not speaking their language, your efforts are going to be in vain. So it's like goes beyond the communication skills. It's really understanding who you're talking with, understanding their prerogatives. Not that it would, should change your advice, but that's just in the way that you're providing actually your advice. So I think this is something that is very, very important and, not talked about sufficiently. You can't be just like sitting in your office writing reports and pitching them. Even those reports, you have to prepare people for receiving them. So there is quite a bit of diplomacy that has to take place. Understanding also the system itself and where you can expect to make a difference, so that number one, you're not disappointed, and number two, you're sort of pitching it at the right time, at the right level. So, to give you an example, in my mandate, it said that, the chief science advisor to ensure that science is appropriately considered in decision making. Well, when I first arrived, I said, okay, well, how do you do this? Like, is this like a formula where actually they need to tick a box about what they've done? And then I look at it and then I laugh at myself now when I think about it, not because such a form doesn't exist, but because by the time such a form exists, so many people have worked on it. It has gone back and forth, probably in draft form to ministers, to cabinet, and then, imagining that you're going to be able to change anything, at that stage is just like. So you need to understand the system, you need to understand the people, the process itself, and also accept that, you'll give advice and it will not necessarily be taken, but don't give up, because I've seen my advice, eventually actually being incorporated when I had almost forgotten about it because I just gave up. Like I thought, that they're not listening. So they just have so many, they're bombarded, right, with imperatives and crises and pulled in all sorts of directions. It's sort of personal discipline not to expect rewards, not in terms of, getting candies and stuff like this, but say, oh, thank you so much. This is great advice. It's going to go right in, this decision. So
Thank you.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. Good advice. So please join me in thanking Mona, Ruth, and Sarah. And now it gives me great pleasure to invite up to the stage Dr. Nick Benoardis, my former professor 30 years ago when we were both 12 years old, to give some closing remarks.
Thank you, Jeff. You still remember? Professor Nemer, thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. This was one of the best talks, very challenging. It's a very challenging time, and we greatly appreciate your presence here and your advice. I must say that about 20 years ago, Professor John de la Motte visited Washington and asked me to have a beer, as I was saying earlier. Have a beer, and during that beer, he said, what would you say to organize an event like this? And of course, John de la Motte was one of the people that I was reading when I was actually a graduate student. And I was very impressed that this person asked me to do this with him. So here we are. Over the years, this event has brought amazing speakers here. And today I was listening to Dr. Nemer, and I remembered, it reminded me the talk that we had heard from an ex-OSTP person right after he exited the OSTP with the end of the Obama administration. So he had served eight years there in the OSTP. He also happens to be our graduate. He is now back in the OSTP in a much better position. He is chief of staff. So Keiko Izumi, who was here at that time, out of the OSTP, and he gave us a great talk, which is online. People can actually watch it, on how you make policy, actually, what happens day after day at the OSTP. And it was a very, very, very complicated stuff. Something that people do not really know. And your talk today really reminded me of that. But there were other great talks over the years. I want to mention last year's talk by the director of the National Science Foundation in the United States, Dr. Panchanathan. And Dr. Panchanathan was a professor of this university before, if I'm not mistaken, right? The University of Ottawa. He gave a great talk, and he referred to this other topic that you referred to, inclusion. So Sarah also talked about inclusion. Inclusion, he calls it the missing millions. Those people, the many millions of people who, for one reason or the other, cannot make it to a scientific career and to a place where they can make some decisions, right? So inclusion has been a major topic now in our science policy. And finally, this attention that I saw about science diplomacy here. Science diplomacy is becoming very, very serious. I must say, the system of the United States that you think that we solved all the problems, we have not. We have not, and I will tell you exactly with science diplomacy where we went backwards. So our Department of State used to have, they have the so-called cones. People who are the diplomats who go through a particular cone, and they have various functions. In the past, several decades ago, there was a science cone that it has been eliminated. Right? So, so here you have an example of an organization which is very, very important, and it's actually across our school at Department of State, and we have not been able to persuade them to reinstate it. Of course, since then they have a science advisor to the secretary, and they always send to us every year actually one diplomat to stay and like a sabbatical, and so this is a huge concern. I very much also appreciated the question from the science advisor from the German embassy, because these are huge issues that we discuss. Now, the final thing that I want to make a comment on is this shocking realization, as you mentioned, I think I heard it, with the pandemic, when we saw actually these controversies in society on how to attack this problem. We have often considered why these things happen, and in my opinion, if I am to check one, I would say that what scientists do is disagreement. That's how we push knowledge forward, right? We disagree, and we disagree very much, and we argue against each other, and we have peer review, and we develop thick skin because people tell you this is BS what you are having out there, and this is completely wrong, and it's not this data, it's not this data. And then what we forget, I guess, this message. In my field, for example, everybody knows that all economists argue with themselves. So they know nothing, right? Economists know nothing because they don't agree about anything, right? So I think this what happens, this image of scientists not agreeing went out suddenly. What's going on? I mean, there's conflicting evidence here, and I have often wondered if scientists actually could have a way. I don't think so, but that scientists could agree on a common message to society. It's problematic, and it changes every day with the research. As we do, we push knowledge forward and the message changes, but it is a challenge for our societies. It is absolutely a major problem. So anyway, I want to close the event. This is my role here, just to close the event. I wanted to thank, in addition to Dr. Nemer here, I want to thank Jeff Kinder there played a major role in the organization of this event. Of course, the two, Sarah and Ruth here sitting in front of us. I want to thank Monica Gattinger here. Of course, we are co-organizer of this event. Paul Dufour, who didn't say a word, Paul is back there. He is really a big a big supporter here, a friend of De La Motte, and really a big person. But I also want to thank the people who really worked, did the nitty-gritty to organize the event, right? I have in front of him here Genevieve. I don't know if she is in the room, but Genevieve Dunn did a lot to get us together. Sandy Chung. Hey! Sandy Chung and the Ottawa Science Policy Network. So these are great people. This event is really because of them. We have also our person back in Washington who is not here. This is Christine. Christine Gilbert also did a lot to organize the American team and the organization down there. So I would like to thank everyone who worked on this, and I want to welcome you next year in Washington. Thank you. Thank you. God bless.